What was that? Beep beep. Right. Preparing to live stream. Facebook just went on a new system, so we'll see if it works for Facebook. Right. Live stream. Facebook just went. Oh, quiet. YouTube is on. Go live now. I don't know what the hell that means. Let me pull up. I'm just going to pull up Facebook and see, because it's a new Facebook decided to change their system today. Let's see if we're on Facebook.
Let's turn this off.
No. Okay. Let's see. What's going on? Oh, looks like we are live. Okay, cool.
Okay.
All right. Let me do this. Let me do this.
The radical, fundamental principles of freedom, rational self-interest, and individual rights. This is the Yaron Brook Show.
All right, everybody, welcome to Yaron Brook Show on this, I thought, beautiful Sunday, but the government of Puerto Rico has just ruined my Sunday and maybe ruined my month. Anyway, before I get to that, we have with us Alex Epstein, and Alex is, I think all of you know who Alex is, but Alex, of course, is the author of The Moral Case for Fossil Fuel, worked at the Institute with me for many years. And I thought I'd bring Alex on today to talk about coronavirus, but really to tap into his expertise in what he did around climate change, because I think it's really interesting. The whole issue is, how do you respond to emergency? And let's assume, and Alex has, I've seen him do this, assume climate change is real to some extent. How do we think about how to respond to a crisis? And I think it'd be useful to have a conversation about how to think about how to respond to coronavirus. So, hi, Alex.
Hey.
Hope they haven't shut down Southern California yet.
No, not yet. I mean, it's really notable, how much of a difference I think it makes to live in different places. I'm sure you'll talk about Puerto Rico, but I'm in Laguna Beach, and I just even think about here versus San Francisco, where I lived a couple of years ago, and I'm really scared for my friends in San Francisco and people in cities, and we could talk about why, but just there's the combination of a virus that's scary, and then the behavior of people that's scary, and then all of the government induced irrationality in the behavior.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I hope Laguna and the rest of Southern California gets spared that, but it's hard to tell where this is going. And then, you've even got some, private hysteria, voluntary hysteria going on as well that is going to constrain the life. But let me quickly fill everybody in on Puerto Rico, because I just heard basically 30 minutes ago, there was a press release from the governor of Puerto Rico that basically she's shutting down the island, which means no businesses are allowed to stay open. No, I don't know yet about restaurants, which is really, really important to my life. Grocery stores are allowed to stay open, and the food chain, kind of anything related to food, is supposed to stay open. I don't know if that relates to restaurant, but everything else basically is being shut down. No more cruise ships. That they already, I think, decided a couple of days ago. But nothing, no activity, no jobs, no work, no pursuit of day-to-day values until the end of the month. So this is for 2 weeks. Now, for me, I work at home anyway, but for me, the big thing is restaurants. And we don't have much food at home because we rely on going out pretty much every night. The food here is fantastic and relatively cheap, and the restaurants are great. And so as soon as we heard this, my wife rushed out to go to the supermarket to buy whatever she can for the next 2 weeks, under the assumption the restaurants are going to be closed. We would never hoard food. We would never go to a grocery store and just stop, because I think mostly that is irrational. But now the government has put us in a position where we have no choice. It's taken the decision out of our hands in terms of what activities to engage in and whatnot, and basically forced us to go hoard food, which I'm sure everybody else in Puerto Rico is doing right now. So I feel bad about doing the show while she's over there. So I'll probably, as soon as this is over, go join her and, fighting the lions and fighting the hordes and getting food. But this relates directly to the post you made. So let's start with that, and then I've got a bunch of others I want to talk about. And you wrote in the post that what's happening is that the government primarily, although I think some even private firms and private individuals are doing this, where they're increasingly treating containment as an unlimited value that wants any amount of disruption of normal life. And yet we all know disrupting normal life has a cost, which nobody is calculating. That is, there's a threat. Clearly Corona is a threat, certainly to some people more than others, but it's clearly a threat. But it's become that threat has become the ultimate value, which eliminating that threat is now the number one value beyond anything else. And what are the consequences of thinking in that way?
So, let's talk about what is normal life. Normal life is basically your chosen values. Mm-hmm. That's what normal life is. And it means how you're choosing to spend your irreplaceable time. You don't get that much of it. And then part of it is how you spend that time determines how much of it you get and how much the future quality is. So if you just take one example, millions and millions of people, their productive ability, their ability to produce value that sustains their life in a given amount of time, it's just completely interwoven with in-person social interaction. And I have this myself. I'm not in the worst situation, but a lot of my income and my business's income, I have several people I employ, depends on in-person speaking events. Yep. What's happened to that? And so it's not that we can say it's wrong necessarily to shut that down, but you really need to be clear that is a huge loss of value. And that's just one of many examples. And I don't hear that acknowledged. And I also don't hear any concern with, in part, with how long that's going to go on. So you can imagine somebody said, okay, we've got a plan. It's 2 weeks. We're going to have to endure a lot of hardship, but.
Whoops, your sound just dropped. One second. You went.
I know this is bugging out. I'm seeing it go. So it might happen a couple more times, but I apologize. It'll encourage me to do shorter answers. So just to complete, if you acknowledge, so I just want to, maybe one broader thing is we want to talk about is just the value of objectivist philosophy to this kind of issue. And here's a case where if you value human life and the pursuit of values, whatever the magnitude of the corona threat, you'd be taking very seriously any restriction in people's normal pursuit of values. And you would really have a plan about how long that is and make it worth it, versus you have people saying, yeah, well, maybe it's 18 months. Maybe your life is going to be disrupted for, that's 18 months of my life. I'm 39 going on 40. So that means I'd be 41 by the time this is over. What's going to happen to my company? I don't
want to tell you how old I will be in 18 months.
I know how old you are. You're always 19 years older than I am.
Round number. It's a scary.
I know you're going to be 60.
I'll be 60 in 18 months. I know.
Yeah. So this needs to be valued. And I don't trust people who say, oh, I've got a really precise account of the threat, but they see no threat whatsoever in disrupting people's lives. And I've seen this when I watch Sam Harris talk with a lot of the smart kind of tech people. Yep. They just trivialize this. So that's just a big flag, and this concern needs to be integrated.
Well, I think it's two things. It's one, that they haven't really internalized the idea of values and individual values and what that means to individuals. And the second is they very much take a philosopher king's approach to this. They're smarter than everybody else. They know more than everybody else. They're rational, whereas they assume most people are not. And therefore they can pick, in a sense, our values for us. And you don't know how risky this is. So I'm going to tell you, this should be your primary value. And this relates to the whole question of who should decide, right? Now, we can talk about the role of government in such situations, and we'll talk about that. But the fact is that part of the assumption here is that if we get information about the true risks involved and what it means to be sick and what it means, what the risks are involved in social interaction, we won't make the right decisions. That we are either too emotional, too stupid, too irrational to make the right decisions. And that some authority, whether it's a Sam Harris, an intellectual authority, or some authority at the political level, who should therefore impose, in a sense, rationality on us. And objectivism is really the only philosophy that tells us that whole way of thinking is wrong, right? That nobody else can choose your values for you. That by choosing values for you, enforcing those values for you, they negate the whole idea of values. Values have to be personal. And that human beings have the capacity to be rational, and this is a time to encourage them to do that. To encourage them to think, to encourage them to actually focus and to actually pursue their values rationally. And what we really want from the experts, people like Sam Harris, is information, is maybe an approach to thinking. He can say, this is how I approach it. This is the way I think of these things. But count on individuals to do their own thinking and to make their own choices about the values that they pursue.
Yeah, and I mean, integrating this with my last point, I mean, these, many of these experts, I mean, I regard their view of values as very alien to mine, and yes. I believe alien to a lot of people. So I'm just thinking about, I was riding Uber yesterday to go to a friend's house. People might think, oh, that's insane. Like, how could you, but so I don't even want to talk about my value calculation.
I was on an airplane for Thursday and Friday. So.
But if I just even think about the driver, like, think about this person's even just physical livelihood. Like, he's doing this to pay the rent. He can get kicked out of his house. This can change the whole trajectory of his life. And so there's just even the economic side, the production side of things, not even recognizing life depends on production above all. So if you impede people's ability to produce values, then you destroy their ability to live. There's no acknowledgement of that, but also the quality issue. Think about the way people are talking about life. They say, like, this many lives could be saved. But what does that really mean? I mean, it's mostly elderly people, and it's saying that they'll die sooner than they otherwise would. And that's a real negative. I mean, you want to avoid that, but they're also saying, oh yeah, maybe 18 months, maybe you're going to lose this time and then lose your productive ability. And so all we have is time. It's not like people have this idea of, oh, either it's life and death or it doesn't matter. Either you're going to die immediately or it doesn't matter. But really, it's you only have so much time. You want to make the most of that time. And so it is really taking away someone's life to take away a huge chunk of their time. And there's just so little value of quality of life. I think because most of the major philosophies don't really value the quality of life on Earth for the individual.
No, and the quality of life for that Uber driver is going to be hurt even more than it is for me. I'll manage. I can afford not to have any income coming in for a while, but he can't. And people who pretend to care about the poor, the working class, or that goes completely out the window in cases like this, where they. Where in a sense, they want everybody to be dependent on them, because their solution to him, the solution to the Uber driver, is to give him welfare, right? The solution is to expand social programs. We saw this with the new bill going through the House. They want to do all these goodies, throw all goodies to people, rather than, again, let people make decisions about their own values. Let people go out and decide. It might make sense for the Uber driver to stop driving. It depends on his circumstances, on his risk tolerance, and on, maybe he's got some lung disease. And if he gets a coronavirus, he could die. His probability is really, really high. He would stop. But as what always happens with government, they plaster all of us with the same assumption, there's no personal values. There is values dictated from the top down, and we're all supposed to just mindlessly follow and obey, in a sense.
And we're going to talk about, I think we're going to talk next, I'm really looking forward to this, just about what real capitalism would mean for this kind of situation,
a few
right?
things I want to cover before we get to that. But yes,
Okay.
we're going to talk to that because I think it's going to be really interesting. But the few things that I want to cover, and then we've got a bunch of super chat questions, but we'll get to them in the end. And I think some of this covers this. So I want to cover a couple of things before we get to that. One is, so does this pandemic or any pandemic prove first that the government has to run healthcare, right? That this is, and I've seen this, right? The Bernie Sanders and his supporters and people in Europe saying, "Oh, you Americans, you're screwed because we have, like Italy, right? They have socialized healthcare, so they're doing great." But this is proof that we need a central authority that can run all this.
And they often say we need it as it needs to be a right. Like this is proof. Yeah. And I mean, I regard this as definitive proof that it's catastrophic for it to be viewed as a right.
Yes, because once you view it as a right, the whole system collapses. And what you're relying on in a crisis like this right now is doctors doing amazing work, is pharmaceutical companies coming up with new innovations and solving the core of the problem. Hospitals being motivated to expand production in a sense by expanding the number of beds and things like that. You're dependent on the market really working and the incentives working, and it not being something that the government provides as in a coerced way, but you're dependent on the human mind now being free to innovate, to produce, to create, and to treat people, to solve the problem, which goes away completely once you term it as a so-called right, once government now provides it and turns doctors, nurses, pharmaceutical companies, medical innovation into government bureaucracies.
Yeah, I mean, I have a really strong view on this. So, let's just say, what does it mean to say something is a right? I mean, if you say there's a right to a value, it means or anything really, it means it's the government's job to define it, A, and to control its pursuit, B. So if you think about something and people think, oh, like education, that's great, that should be right. Okay, then the government gets to define what education is, and it gets to control the pursuit of it by force, versus if you have rights to action, but not rights to values, then all the government says is you can't interfere with other people's action, but then you get to define the values and you get to use your judgment in pursuing them, particularly producing them. So let's look at what's happening in this situation. I think two of the biggest failures are, one, the massive failure of testing, and two, the massive failure or fear about scaling. This idea that, oh, we can't have more hospital beds, we can't have more practitioners. So if, just to take it quickly, what if we had freedom in testing versus government controlled testing? This is a total failure of the government has defined a right. And so it gets to define what a good test is or isn't. And guess what? A bunch of bureaucrats got it wrong compared to millions of people being free. How could that be at all surprising? And then in terms of scaling, you see all these people saying, oh, the system can't accommodate this. Like if you're free people, think about and you had a free system, we would be paying people to scale. We would have a profit motive and be paying people to scale. You'd be able to scale the machines, you'd be able to scale the locations, and you would be free to have people go into the field. The people who are getting out of work in one field would be trained quickly to do the things that they could do. But notice the government controls the pursuit of it. So all of these things are constrained. Now, part of what is good is despite that we have the most capitalism argument, so there's going to be a lot of really interesting human ingenuity. But in a real capitalist system, we would have individuals, including the smartest individuals, defining what health is, what healthcare is, including testing. And you'd have all this ingenuity and resources going into the solving it. It would just look totally different. And many of us are going to die because we're not free right now.
Absolutely. And the scope of the ingenuity, the scope of the innovation is bound by what the government allows us to do, right? So yes, they still don't completely regulate pharmaceuticals, although through the FDA, they really do. But they're allowing right now pharmaceutical companies to innovate with vaccines. But even then they're saying 12 to 18 months, really? So we need to test everything the way we test things that have to deal with prolonged disease. You can't, if somebody's dying in the ICU right now, we can't inject them with a virus that hasn't been tested on mice yet because, God forbid, they might die. They're dying anyway. Things like that. Innovation is restricted and slowed dramatically, but also, I just heard that Colorado. Think about how innovative this is. Colorado is now agreeing that if you were licensed as a doctor in a different state, they'll let you, for the purpose of this emergency, practice medicine in Colorado. Right?
That's perfect.
Isn't
perfect?
So think about the fact, for example, the state of Washington right now and New York City have a lot of cases, and there are parts of the country that have very few cases. In normal times, the hospitals would pay doctors to come, let's say from Louisiana, let's say they have few cases, to Washington to treat patients, right? But they can't because they're not licensed in Washington state. Same with nurses, same with lots of the caregiving professions. If you're a retired doctor, your license might have expired. It's not clear that you can come back and practice in an emergency situation. And this is, multiply this by thousands of things we can't even imagine. And this will go to my view about how capitalism deals with it. It's hard to imagine. All the thousands of things that the government controls in little and big ways that restrict our ability to respond in flexible ways to a crisis like that. All they do is constrain us.
Yeah, I really think, you can't guess what it would be like exactly, but I totally think that many of the service people would rapidly go in on a temporary basis to medicine. If you look at the major, I don't know if I hope we talk about energy. A lot of what's going on is you just need certain types of machines put near certain people. It's not like you need the most skill in every aspect, but you need human beings able to help people use the machines to build things. You could just have we do this in military, right? During certain times, we put people in war. That's a specialized thing, but the government gets to define it. And it gets to control the pursuit of it. And so all this ingenuity is completely restrained by the very narrow view of a few people who get to define it and control it. And the whole fear is, what if you do something wrong with your life? And my view is, well, that's my life. That's my decision. But I want to be free to use my judgment. And I want 330 million people to be free to use.
Oops, they went again. Your Zoom
so I can benefit from I can benefit from their rational judgment. I don't know which million people screwed up my Zoom, but I can see it as soon as it fails. I'm trying to time my answers because it's cutting out on a kind of every 4 minutes. But I'll
That's weird. All right, maybe it's because the Zoom people are working at home and they're not actually in the right environment.
I always blame it on running on wind power.
There you go. Perfect. So I think the whole idea of this is the idea of government healthcare provision. Empirical evidence, just looking around the world, you can see the massive failures of government-run healthcare systems right now. Italy being the primary, but you're going to see it throughout Europe. And the failure in the United States of those areas where the government is touching, which is way too much. It's not like we have free medicine and freedom in medicine, and that the Europeans are constrained. And testing is the best example because testing should be easy, right? They had 2 months to prepare. We've known about this for 2.5 months, that it was going to come here, that it was going to happen. Nobody in the government, they turned down a test that the WHO had because they wanted an American-made test. So the Trump administration, built in America. So they built their own test. It was a failure. They didn't allow private labs. They didn't allow private companies to build their own tests. It had to be done by the
American-made should mean made in freedom, not made by the government.
It should be use the best test available in the world.
Right.
If you want to improve on it, then let's improve on it. But in the meantime, use the best test that's available in the world and don't reject it because it's made elsewhere, which is going to relate to the second point, the second question about kind of things that this supposedly proves. And it's just, to me, it's the exact opposite. And we'll get to how capitalism would respond, but it's exact opposite. What we need is more freedom. And that's true in day-to-day life on an everyday basis. And it's true in emergencies. Emergencies don't prove that freedom doesn't work. Emergencies if anything, proved the opposite. Freedom works, and it's no accident, by the way, that free countries win wars, that free countries do better in emergencies. The free countries, you've documented really well. The free countries do better in climate catastrophes, hurricanes, tsunamis, things like that. Free countries tend to be wealthier countries, tend to be more innovative countries, tend to be more entrepreneurial countries. And as a consequence, they deal with shocks, they deal with surprises far better than regimented, controlled, centrally planned countries.
Can you talk about energy at some point? If
you want to pull in the parallel with energy, energy.
Or just
there's a parallel here, but there's a requirement. We need energy right now, right?
Yeah. So maybe we can I'll talk about just the requirement and then the parallel. So you just look at what are we depending on right now. We've talked about if we had more freedom, then there much more productive ability and much more judgment would be brought to bear on this problem. But what are we depending on, even with the limited amount of ability we have? Two things we're obviously depending on that are very related are, one is machine power. We're depending on these amazing modern machines and these amazing high electricity hospitals to literally, prevent maybe millions of people from dying. That's one. And then two, we're relying on human time, on the time of medical professionals to be able to help treat and diagnose and treat and cure people. So both of those are totally dependent upon low cost, reliable energy. And that's where the fossil fuel connection comes in. Fossil fuels are, for billions of people, by far the lowest cost, most reliable form of energy they have. And so the lower cost, more reliable energy is, the more people can afford to use machine power, and the more time is freed up because we have machine power to produce the basics, namely food, water, shelter. And so what you have today is we have this amazing ability to respond with all these machines and all these people. But if you had anything like a Green New Deal, what happens is machine power becomes much more expensive and human time becomes much more scarce because it's devoted to manual labor. And it's the energy is only partially related to what's happening in Venezuela, but you can see that the decline of the ability to use machine power and the decline of freed up human time. People their time goes to the most crude things. You literally regress to a worse and more natural way of life. So I just want to point out how the whole amazing ability we have to respond, both the machine power and the time, is totally dependent on the level of our ability to produce energy. And there's nothing that's even close to fossil fuels. So when people are thinking about, all these lives are being saved, well, fossil fuels are saving those lives.
Absolutely. You couldn't get the foods, you couldn't get the food produced. Think of all the machines that use fossil fuels and produce the food and then deliver it, and then refrigeration, and then keep the supermarkets open, and all the different stages, every single step in the supply chain. It requires massive amounts of energy. And that energy, if it was run by wind power, if it was run by solar energy, it would be, the whole food supply chain would collapse and we would be literally starving. There's no way to supply the billions of people on planet Earth today with the kind of food, the food we need unless we use fossil fuels, unless we use the cheapest, most efficient form of energy production available right now.
And then let me just comment quickly on the parallel issue. So it's, a lot of my focus on, for those of you familiar with my work on energy, is that, with looking at fossil fuels, I say, look at it the same way you look at a decision to use an antibiotic. You need to look at both the benefit and the side effect, and you need to weigh them. And what you absolutely can't do is say, my goal is zero side effects. That's all I care about, like zero impact on climate. No, you have to look at, your goal is to benefit human life as much as possible. And what the parallel to what we discussed before is that people, their whole focus is, let's reduce the virus to zero. That's all. Their whole standard should be, what will reduce transmission of virus, almost regardless of what it does to individual human lives. And that's why you can have this craziness of saying, yeah, interrupt your life for 18 months maybe, or not even feeling compelled to tell people a plan, or even if you're not sure yet, to say, like, look, I know this is a huge hardship. We're super scared, but we're going to have a plan. There's going to be a limit on this. There's almost no acknowledgement of value. And you see in practice, people are acting this way. The only organization I've seen that seems to value the livelihood in terms of events is the Ultimate Fighting Championships, the mixed martial arts, which I have some background in.
Yep.
I mean, what they're doing is they're restricting audiences, but they're holding these fights. And these fights, I mean, maybe people can't sympathize with this, but these are people's livelihood. They've been spending 12 weeks, tens of thousands of dollars, their whole future. They've been investing 10 years. Like, it should be terrifying to think, I mean, it's just heart-wrenching to think, oh, I'm going to take this away. Those people should absolutely not do that to infinitesimally reduce some vulnerable people's risk. And it's just, that's a total sacrifice.
And what's amazing here is we know exactly who's vulnerable. We know that if you're over 60 with some health issues, over 70, pretty much everybody, over 80, definitely, you're in real danger with this. The mortality rate is fairly high in these cases if you get it. So it's relatively easy to first tell people in that age group to isolate themselves. Don't see your grandkids. Don't go visit your parents and your grandparents. You know, hire them somebody who can bring them food and who can supply them with the necessities. You can do it. You know, there's so many things that we can do to make the lives of the people who really are susceptible to this relatively easy without shutting down the whole of society and without interrupting the values of everybody. All right, one more issue in terms of the things that people are saying, hey, this is proof that we need to do it differently, right? This is proof that freedom doesn't work in some capacity. And then I think we'll go to how a capitalist government would deal with this, or capitalism would deal with this. And then we'll take a few questions. I might not take all the questions because I really do need to run and go help my wife with stocking up. But, you know, good example of disrupting our values. But so I'm getting a lot of messages and in the super chat as well and everywhere else. Oh, this is proof that globalization is bad. This is proof that we need to build everything at home because we're short on XYZ, fill in the blank of what we're short that's being manufactured in country XYZ, primarily China, because we like to beat up on China. But in China or somewhere else, or we're dependent on this, dependent on that, and we can't produce it at home. Therefore, we must bring all production home so that we can make sure that in emergencies, or one in a 80-year or 10-year or 15-year time, we will have everything we need to cope with this situation.
Yeah.
I mean, that is equivalent to saying, in my situation right now in Puerto Rico, why the hell did my ancestors ever leave the subsistence farm? Life would be so much easier if I had a farm out here in the Puerto Rican hills and I was growing all my food and I didn't have to rely on the supply chain that the supermarkets are engaged in. I wouldn't have to rely on all these, you know, on companies that might be shutting down and other things. I could just take care of myself and just produce everything that I need, well, and therefore not rely on them.
Yeah, but there's also the dimension that, so when we're talking about capitalism, I mean, capitalism is the system that emerges from the protection of individual rights. And that's often lost. People just think capitalism is people doing whatever they feel like and for money. And so if you look at part of the job under capitalism of a government under which capitalism emerges is to define rights, including things like if other countries are bringing over things, like they have practices where they have bats, you know, in their food and stuff. That's the kind of thing our government should have an interest in and should be vigilant about. So often I think the way we deal in trade, the government isn't always thinking through all the potential rights violations. But I mean, just the productive ability gain that you get from being able to deal with 7 billion other people around the world versus not, I mean, that is so many years to your life in every dimension. This is kind of a funny example, but you would like it, like this show. You can hear me now, right?
Yep.
The show Mr. Sunshine that you turned me on to, like I heard somebody say, you know, like, oh, why, you know, we only want American shows and stuff. And I'm just thinking, how amazing is it that kind of people who embody kind of the best of what America stands for are creating things around the world. And you just think, oh, isn't it amazing that we can trade with over 7 billion people, including, by the way, we can trade with them to benefit when we do idiotic things ourselves, like Green New Deal. I mean, part of the reason of our standard of living is we're trading with China, who's smart enough to use lower cost energy more consistently than we are. So I think that you can look for ways in which rights can be better defined, but I mean, you have to think about your productive ability is like a fundamental determinant of your ability to survive and flourish. And trade is essential to that. Human interaction is essential to that for many people. Energy is essential to that. And we see across the board, people are just ignoring life requires production. And so your productive ability is the fundamental. And that's why freedom is fundamental to all those values.
And it also goes back to something you said earlier about the emergency is the dealing with the emergency is the number one value in life, right? So now we have to shut down trade in order for when there's an emergency.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have to sacrifice years of our lives in normal life years in order to deal with a once in a lifetime kind of situation where there's an emergency. Not to mention that the whole thing is bogus, right? So the fact is that even if we brought back production to the United States, let's say of, I don't know, anything, masks, right? There's only so much you could scale production in the United States if all the masks were being made in the United States. But the fact that you can scale them up much faster in China, and you can scale them up much faster in lots of other countries. We could be importing masks from all kinds of countries right now who are really actually scaling up production. It's not just our ability to scale up in one geographic area. You're taking advantage of multiple geographic areas of the ability to scale. The profit motive works on a global scale. Demand for certain products is going to increase during an emergency, which means capital will flow into those industries. Labor will flow into those industries. There'll be a huge increase in supply of those products. Nobody's gonna, now again, if China's an enemy country and it wants to see the United States crushed by the virus and it restricts the ability of their companies to sell us stuff, then, that's a problem. If we believe that, then we should treat China as an enemy. Okay, that's a whole different foreign policy issue. But in a normal course of events, Chinese companies want to make money. They sell us the stuff on large scales. So the whole idea that you sacrifice normal life for the emergency is nuts. And secondly, in an emergency, you want supply chains that are robust, that are working well. I mean, one of the first things I would have done if I were president would be lower tariffs to zero as soon as an emergency happened. I would have done that well before this. But one of the best things to do in an emergency is to take out any restraints on trade, any restraints on production, any restraints on people able to voluntarily supply the goods that are necessary in order to deal with the crisis.
And just one quick comment is with the normal life, you can think of it from an objectivist perspective. It's the interference with the pursuit of values. That is the emergency. Like that's what we regard as that's the worst thing you can do is prevent. I mean, so in any kind of sustained way, you have a weight to that versus no, the only thing that can happen is some sort of human caused threat. And so all we need to do is we just need to restrict our action infinitely so that we don't make a mistake that ends up hurting us.
Yep. So let's talk about how capitalism would deal with the pandemic. What would happen under capitalism? And what would happen, with a proper government limited to its role as protecting individual rights. That is, so what individual rights, how does individual rights apply to something like a pandemic?
Well, I mean, so the major examples I've been thinking of, I already mentioned, so I'm curious to see yours, because I mean, I mentioned certainly just the broad idea of it's rational individuals using their own judgment. They define what health and healthcare are, and then they get to control the production and pursuit of it. So that obviously applies to tests. It applies to the scaling of hospitals. I think there's one other interesting dynamic, which maybe you could shed more light on, which is just, there should be a huge amount of profit incentive to help people here. And it seems like in many cases, they're being told, oh, just give this away. Like I want, if my life is at stake or other people's lives are at stake, I want to be able to pay a fortune. I want people to be able to make a fortune to cure this. So I'm really interested in other dynamics that you've noticed or thought about.
Yes. So let me just say this. So the role of a government in a pandemic like this is very limited. It's limited to protection of rights. And that means it's limited to restricting the ability. So restricting the ability of people who actually are a threat to other people from being mobile. So if you carry the virus, if we know you have the virus, you should not be out there flying on planes and doing other things. This is, by the way, why it's so important to have testing. For example, if I could test myself before a flight and, before I left and before every trip, then it would be much safer for me and it would be much safer for everybody else, because I would know this is okay to fly because I don't have the virus, and now it's not okay to fly. I should stay home. There was a case where this guy was went on a flight at JetBlue. Now, initially it was reported that as he left the flight, he told the flight attendants, "Oh, by the way, I've got coronavirus." Now, it turned out that he had been tested before they took off, I guess, a couple of days, and he got the results while he was in the air.
Oh, I see.
Now, he shouldn't have flown anyway if he suspected. But let's say in a capitalist country, somebody like that is on a flight and gets off and says, "Hey, I'm corona positive." Somebody like that should be arrested. I mean, that's criminal, because he's clearly endangering the values, the lives of the people around him. He is acting, he knows, he has the information, he knows he should be arrested and prosecuted. That's criminal. Somebody could die on that flight for getting the virus from him. So the government's job is to quarantine those people that we know have the virus, or to make sure they quarantine themselves.
But this is with a certain level, right? Because it can't be, well, if you have a cold, then the government gets to say you can't move. And part of it should be, private institutions setting their own. So there's a certain level at which, if it was like super contagious Ebola, where the guy dies immediately, it's kind of obvious. And then this seems to be a case where it's warranted, but it's not. There has to be some threshold that's
absolutely
rational.
And this is where it's hard, right? So none of these things are easy. And the whole idea that government is limited to protection of individual rights, that sounds easy and straightforward. No, you have to figure out, what does violation of individual rights mean in this context? Is giving somebody a cold a violation of their rights? Not really. It's clearly not a good thing, but it's so inevitable. It's so, to restrict people's ability to move if they've got a cold would be so debilitating to civilization that it's just absurd. So where is the limit? That's why we need experts. We need real experts in the science. We need real experts in applying science to the question of individual rights. And we need somebody to be able to say, yes, this is actually an emergency. This is a real threat. There really is something here. Ebola is a clear example, although Ebola is very hard to transmit from human to human.
No, I was just saying,
Yes, if it was that deadly, then it's clear cut. If it's cold, clearly it's not an emergency. Coronavirus probably qualifies, but you'd have to have some meat there. You'd have to have some real argument. You couldn't just arbitrarily do it. So the government would have a role in defining this as, hey, yes, this is what qualifies as violating rights. We're letting you know. And they would have to be objective about it, and they have to communicate about it so that we would know what they consider violation of rights. That's what objective law requires.
Well, I have a challenge to that, or at least there, because I think, one thing is, if it's doing that, part of it is it has to incorporate all the things we've mentioned before. So it has to really value normal, productive life. It can't act like we're doing this out of. But
we're talking about a capitalist government
that has the right. It's ultimately based on values, and do you value production, and do you value the pursuit of happiness? But one thing I've been thinking of is, if we actually had protection of rights across the board, that means everything wouldn't be this common area that then it's the government's jurisdiction. The plane, the airports, the streets, these would be places where they could set their own private policies. And then the burden of proof for a government would be something that's so airborne that it cuts across people's property very easily, and then you have to adjudicate it. So I think if you had more capitalism, these things would be much more resolved.
Yes, and there'd be an incentive for the airlines to produce policies and make them clear.
Yeah.
For the owner of the street to announce, or the owner of the restaurant, okay, you're not welcome here if you.
And you could choose where to go.
Yeah, although, of course, because some of these things you can't test, and you can't test very quickly, and it's hard to know if you have it or not. So, but private individuals would figure out. And again, because this is primarily deadly to older people, it would be pretty clear. Old people shouldn't go out. It shouldn't be enforced by the government, but it should just be a clear incentive for them not to go out. And they're, in a sense, taking on a risk. if they are going out, and it's their responsibility, it's their risk that they're taking on. In terms of industry, I think here, you know, you could get the imagination go wild. Who has an incentive, profit incentive, to restrict the spread of the virus, to make sure that people get well quickly and efficiently, and to make sure there are enough hospital beds, to make sure that actually all this, the entire supply chain associated with the virus, functions efficiently and well. I mean, there's one industry that is really should be vested in this and have a profit incentive around this, and that's the insurance industry. I mean, insurance companies would play a huge role in these kind of situations, right? They have an interest in testing, because if you test, then you can self-isolate and it won't spread, and they won't have to pay the hospital bills for lots of people. They have an interest in getting the people who are really sick quickly into a hospital so that they can be treated as early as possible so they don't deteriorate, so they have to do the most expensive stuff, which is kind of the ICU stuff. They have an interest in getting a vaccine quickly. So they have an interest in increasing their own investment in vaccine. They have an interest in antivirals so that we can quickly get antivirals to as many people as possible and cure them and get them out of the hospital, which is very expensive for an insurance company. So insurance companies have a massive interest here. And I think this is true in so many different realms that it's hard to imagine in a free market how important insurance would be more broadly. You know, you can think about fires, you can think about safety in the roads, who has an incentive to have people drive safely. Well, insurance companies, because if you don't drive safely, they're the ones who actually pay the bills often. There's all kinds of ways in which insurance companies are motivated in a truly capitalist economy to make sure the products that we're buying and selling are good products or safe products, to make sure, you know, you could imagine that instead of an FDA, insurance companies would hire labs to check drugs that they would then be approved by the insurance companies to be given to people in consultation with doctors, because that's what they would cover. And you could go on and on and on in the different ways in which a business like insurance is incentivized to reduce its expenses, maximize its profits, and therefore participate in an active way in the entire supply chain, which is the delivery of health or the delivery of healthcare, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's just so, man, it's just these, and I would just say, as you know, as both of us, you know, we're going to be more prosperous than the average person, in part just living in, you know, in the freest part of the world, but even within that. And, you know, the thing that most affects us is our longevity, is the lack of freedom in medicine. Like, that's the thing where one of us will die of something, and then 10 years later, there will be a cure for it. And it's because people slowed down progress. Like, for
Absolutely.
sure, that's where the leverage is.
Science and all of this stuff that people don't even invest in, don't even go into, because the FDA has basically said, we're not interested, we're not going to approve that. Think about all the dollars that would go, all these billionaires who are spending money going to Mars. They might be spending money on life extension. They think that they could get by the regulation to go to Mars. I'm not convinced of that. But, you know, they know they can't get by the regulations to produce life extension stuff. So they put some money into it, but imagine the flood of capital that would go into that if the FDA was not involved, if the FDA was not, you didn't need permission in order to do science and produce products that were actually extending human life. So absolutely. I mean, the way in which, and this is what is really scary about the whole Medicare for all and government takeover of healthcare. If we think it's bad now, it's like a million times worse when the government takes over the entire healthcare system. And the fact is that the rest of the world still relies on the US for medical innovation, for new treatments, for new ways of thinking about disease, because our doctors are relatively free. And they have, you know, we are in a sense subsidizing the entire world's healthcare systems because we are still free and they are not. And when we are gone, then there's nobody to subsidize our healthcare system. There's nobody to innovate. There's nobody to come up with new treatments. There's nobody else out there in the world. There's nowhere to go to get freedom in healthcare, which is so crucial to individual life.
I mean, kind of one promising area is just the digital revolution and, mental sort of machine power, which they call AI, which is not really the right way to think of it. But in terms of these machines that can really amplify our mental abilities, that's pretty exciting. And then in part, probably some of the relaxation of things in response to this may lead to some of the evolution of medicine, including, you mentioned, you can now have a doctor in Colorado who didn't come from Colorado, more of the telemedicine. I mean, just think about, there's no way that it would all be these like doctor visits where you're paying your $30. It's just these random stuff versus all the stuff we're doing digitally. So I think that there's just so much. I have one comment about objectivism and all of this. So we could think of capitalism as what would it look like if we had real capitalism? But I've thought about, in this crisis in particular, what would it be like if, say, there were 10 times the penetration or prevalence of objectivist philosophy? And I think of, okay, what are, with the things we've been talking about, I mean, in terms of one thing objectivist philosophy offers is really good methodology for understanding and, by implication, explaining things. And how much better off would we be if there were a lot of people who could clearly explain what's going on? I mean, we're fortunate we have our friend Amesh Adalja, who's been helpful, but imagine you had dozens of people like that. And then if you think about it, now your thinking methods are going to be related to your values, because how are you even deciding what the values are when you're explaining something? Well, people who really value individual lives and the pursuit of happiness and can give us risks in that context. And then, related to that is just causal principles, being able to explain the way things work and the way they interrelate with a lot of precision. I mean, the way people just throw around all these terms like, oh, this is exponential and this is just not the level of clarity. And so one thing I find that, as an objectivist intellectual myself, I find this as a kind of inspiring, but also a challenge to think about, okay, how can this way of thinking be spread so that there are specialists in different fields who can bring clarity? And it's part of what I've tried to do with the energy issue and associated environmental issues. But I'm really feeling like, I wish there were more people who had this, because it makes it so hard to make these life and death decisions. And the other philosophical perspectives or lack of perspectives just aren't doing the job. So our whole knowledge system just isn't giving us something that's nearly as good as what I know is possible based on what objectivism makes possible.
I mean, I think absolutely. I mean, wouldn't it be great if we had right now people who, because right now I think there's a lot we don't know about this virus. I mean, there's a lot that is still weird to me in terms of how it's spreading, in terms of why it's spreading in one way in Italy and a different way in China and South Korea, and the Brits. Johnson's government is treating this completely differently, and they've got a whole different approach to it that's based on behavioral science and some statistical modeling that they're doing, which is completely different. And I'm finding, just reading about all these different things and what they're doing, it's bewildering to me exactly what is going on and what is the real science behind it, and what is voodoo and what is real. And it would be great if we had specialists. And Amesh is swamped, so he can only do so much. But if we had specialists in all these sub fields that could actually, enlighten us in terms of what is actually going on, so we can make better value judgments about our own lives, because it is kind of spooky what's going on. To what extent could this evolve? What extent to this could really be a threat to our lives? I mean, we don't know, because we don't have the kind of clear presentation of science that would be required for us to have real visibility in what the level of threat really is. And it's very frustrating. And reading about it, it's so difficult to find any kind of really good information about what's going on in the world.
Yeah,
other than just what the government is saying, which is it's impossible to know the value of the information they bring out.
This is slightly promotional, but like, I've been working for a while on the second version of the moral case for fossil fuels, and part of it is I've brought in more like objectivist talent to help me think through some of the stuff. And, it'll be out, I think definitely at some point next year by then. But it's like, I'm really seeing I just, what I try to give people an energy, what I would want anywhere, which is a really clear account, including that helps you make sense of all the different conflicting claims you hear. Part of it is you read these articles and they're so disjointed and you don't know how one thing relates to the other. You don't know how to, and so part of what you would want is for each presentation to be engaging the most plausible arguments of the others and showing where they're going wrong. So if anyone has any recommendations of people who are actually doing this, you can email me at alex@alexepstein.com or email Yaron. But I mean, just to find one or two or three really good thinkers could save so much. Absolutely.
And in any, imagine if there were thousands or millions so that every field had real objective thinkers in them. I mean, it's hard to imagine what a truly capitalist, truly free world looks like, but
it doesn't even need to be, we don't even need it to be totally free. We just need more of young, smart people to be excited by it.
Every increment that gets us closer to that or gets more people thinking properly is going to improve our lives dramatically. I was going to say exponentially, but I'm not sure everybody knows what that means, but dramatically, and really exponentially, because it does work exponentially. Brain power works exponentially. It's why having more humans on the planet is a good thing, not a bad thing. Let's see. So, there's a bunch of stuff I had planned to talk about.
Don't we get paid to answer some of these questions?
Yes, so some of these questions get paid. I get paid anyway. Yeah. But what I'm going to do is this, because I am constrained a little bit on time, is there's a bunch of questions on energy that people want to ask you, Alex. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to invite Alex back to talk about energy. And I'm going to keep all these questions, and we're going to use these questions as part of our discussion.
Okay, that sounds good.
So does that sound good, Alex? So
sure.
We'll keep all those. And I'm going to focus just on the questions relating to the pandemic. So the first one is thoughts about the shortage of drugs only produced in China. So I've commented a little bit about that, but let me say this, and this relates to this insurance company question. There is a massive incentive in a private economy, a capitalist economy, for companies to think about worst case scenarios, particularly when it's their business to think about worst case scenarios. Again, insurance, right? Or hospitals or doctors, right? And one of the things that companies would do in scenarios like that is, the couple of possibilities. One, they would stockpile in advance certain medicines, knowing that there's going to be something bad that happens. And it could be a coronavirus, could be a million other different things, but it's kind of a good idea for an insurance company or for a hospital to stockpile certain things. And again, remember, this is consistent with the profit motive. And indeed, it's required by the profit motive if you're thinking about profit in a long-term sense. And so there was certainly be a certain stockpiling of things. Second, it goes back to how you view China. If an industry views China as suspect, both in terms of supply chain or in terms of a political enemy, then you might consider having production local. And, it's not bad to have it for emergencies. Or you might even, and I've said this about steel, from a national defense perspective, what I would suggest be done with steel, for example, is build some plants and mothball them, right? Mothball them so that if an emergency happens, you can start them running, immediately or fairly quickly. And you could incentivize existing steel companies to do that. And that's one thing a government could do in the case of war for steel. But you could imagine, again, that thoughtful, long-term thinking companies would actually think about the supply chain, think about disruptions to the supply chain and how they would cope if situations like that happen. Maybe you have a factory in Mexico as well as in China. And under the assumption that if one of those supply chains breaks, the other one will not. So there are lots of things that the market can do. The one thing is that the government has no role here, right? Again, unless there's rights violation, the Chinese are spiking the drugs they're sending us with tracking devices so they can track anybody who takes it. I'm kidding, but they're selling us a fraudulent product. But other than that, where's the government's role here? There is no role for government in trade, period. And if you want to add anything to add to that.
No, I agree with that.
Okay, can you discuss the morality of economics, of price gouging, why people oppose it, and what the consequences are in outlawing it in relation to the coronavirus, still selling out of many things? You want me to take this?
Yeah.
I mean, price gouging is great because basically what price gouging is, or the ability to change prices, is it makes sure that the people who value the thing the most get it, right? So the more I value something, the more I'm willing to pay for it, the more I'm going to get it. So imagine if supermarkets, when they realized that people were going to buy lots of toilet paper, raise the price of toilet paper. And then the people, then you'd buy fewer of them, so they'd be more for people. And then you would buy as many as your values necessitated based on the new price. And the higher the price went, the more important toilet paper would have to be to you for you to actually buy that. And if it wasn't that important, you wouldn't buy it. And so it's consistent with individuals' hierarchy of values for the price, to allow the prices to fluctuate based on supply and demand.
Just one quick thing about that is just to connect this to my theme about the fundamentality of productive ability.
Yes.
Really what you want is just the ability to produce more value with less cost, which really means less human time. And you can think of it as like most of us cannot afford to produce and power a private jet. But the more free we are and the lower cost energy is, the more different kinds of machines and other values we can afford. And this includes the less we're interfering in trade, the better we can do. So when we see things like this, the focus should be, oh my gosh, you're charging $20 for a hand sanitizer. That I think they should, if.
Sure. Oops, now you froze. You there?
Yeah, you can't hear me?
Okay, you froze. So
No,
$20
no.
for hand sanitizer.
Oh, I was just saying, like, we should, if you have the idea of what freedom leads to increased productive ability, if you see any kind of like sustained disruption, you should be looking for where is there an interference with our productive ability, not where can the government come in and right this wrong.
Yeah, and gouging, the ability to raise prices, increases incentives to produce more, increases incentives for new players to enter the market. And yes, there might be a time lag, right, between the emptying of the store shelves and between new production. But the emptying of the store shelves sends a clear signal to producers to ramp up significant production. So I think price gouging is economically necessary, and the government stepping in to stop that kind of behavior is actually harmful to our values and harmful for the ability of producers to produce more to satisfy the demand that exists out there. Do you think collectivists get a perverse joy in situations like a pandemic because we're all in this together?
Yeah, unfortunately, yes.
I think so too. Yeah, I'll just say I think so too. While Alex unmutes. Yeah, I think they do get that perverse joy, and particularly I think the people who want to promote socialized healthcare. So these emergencies are great opportunities for government to take over more power, to take over more control, for people to advocate for more collectivism. And anytime they disrupt our personal values and our ability to interact based on our personal values, they get a certain pleasure out of that.
Well, the pleasure I'm most disturbed by is the pleasure Bernie Sanders is taking right now. If you just read his Twitter feed, and it's because there's a certain dominant framework of thinking about these things that he's consistent with. And so this is all just vindication for him. Oh, if only the government were fully in charge of healthcare, then everything would have gone perfectly because my government would have made all the right decisions and nobody would have to pay. Nothing would have to be produced. And so no one would have to pay for anything. And so it's just really important that we have a true and opposing framework and that's part of why I was excited to do this topic, is we can show, no, when you liberate people, when you protect not the non-existent right to consume healthcare, but the right to pursue or to produce healthcare, that's when you get an amazing way of life. And the healthcare we have is based on the right to produce healthcare, and the much better healthcare we would have would be based on a much more consistent recognition of the right to produce healthcare.
Yeah, and part of part of what we don't know is what we don't know, right? All the amazing things that healthcare would be producing right now in a free society. And we can't imagine what that would be, how quickly vaccines, how quickly we'd get an antiviral, maybe before it even reached the United States. Scientists, entrepreneurs would have been thinking about this from day one that it had been discovered. Maybe 10 years ago when coronaviruses became a thing, people would have been already working on this and thinking about it. Instead, we expect government to solve all our problems. We look for government, and it creates passivity of thought. It shrinks the scope of how people use their reason, how people think about the future and think about the possibilities that they have. And that is the real danger. The real danger is the shrinking of our values, and shrinking of our mind, and shrinking of our planning, and shrinking of what is possible. And as we shrink like that, human life gets smaller, not just shorter, which I think it will ultimately, but also smaller in the sense of fewer values to pursue, fewer values that are being created and being produced.
There's also just one thing,
right.
is it's a non-trivial thing that how preoccupied we are with climate catastrophe as just an overwhelming focus. And one thing I've been writing, that hopefully that'll be the last one of this. The thing I've been writing about and thinking about was just making a list of things that I'm much more scared of than climate catastrophe. And one of them, I thought of it as antibiotic resistance, but more broadly, it's just diseases that we can't deal with. And you think about how little focus there has been on infectious diseases versus change in climate conditions, even though, as I've pointed out many times, the climate death rate has been dramatically plummeting for the last 100 years. So we're actually, I think of it as, we're not a climate emergency, we're a climate renaissance in terms of our safety from climate, yet everyone is preoccupied with any fluctuation of weather. And you can't pay attention to everything. And so when you're so focused on just, oh, we're ruining the world, et cetera, you're particularly not focused on natural threats. Yep. And like natural threats from disease and infection and stuff like that. And that's a really costly preoccupation, that we're so focused on something that's not a real problem, and we're not focused on things that are. And there's plenty of challenges that we face, both from our own evolution and just from the ever-present dangers of nature, that are much more worth thinking about.
Absolutely. And again, there's no, we don't pursue those things because we've handed it over to government to think about them. We've handed over the responsibility for these things. And it again shrinks that scope of what people, I think, actually are willing to think about and are willing to plan for. Okay, 3 quick ones. Should we hold China accountable for the outbreak morally, or some kind of penalty? This is a kind of foreign policy question, but what does it mean to hold China accountable? I guess you could tell China, we're not willing to deal with you unless you have these particular policies about hygiene or something like that. But really, I doubt that you could hold China accountable for an outbreak of a virus. And now, while this virus probably came in a particular path that we can identify as linked to particular habits the Chinese have, there are going to be other viruses that you won't be able to do that. And I think it would be a dangerous precedent. But I'm curious, what do you think?
I'm interested. Amesh's interview on Sam Harris, I found it compelling, particularly at the end, where he talked about like how much of this is just certain kinds of use of animals.
Yeah.
And so at least that should be on our thinking about, okay, there are certain kinds of practices that can lead to these very deadly things. There's a whole bunch of things that they don't come from. And so that we should at least have aware. So I'm sympathetic to it, but you need to
ban those practices, though. I'm sure that people here in the U.S. who do weird stuff with live animals and again, this is one in a gazillion interactions with these animals that produces this. I don't know how you would define it clearly and objectively enough to ban it. So, you would need a real specialist. You would need to be clear on exactly what it is and what the odds are. I don't know how you would do it. I don't know what in practice.
But are any of these things coming from the US? It seems like they're generally coming from like primitive practices in certain, I would really like, this is why I would like an set of objectivist specialists or like thinking specialists who could really just give the precision of how these things work. And that's going to be part of defining the policy.
I think that's right. They come from certain types of cultures, but then what does that actually mean, and how do you literally ban certain practices when, again, the probability of harm is so low? So I don't know. I think it's an interesting question. I don't think today you could do anything. I think you'd have to have some really much better thinking than we have today in the world in terms of what you would actually do about it. And it's not that we imported this through food. I mean, you could say, we ban certain products from China or something like that because they're likely to have this. You'd have to literally ban certain practices from any country. Otherwise, you say we won't trade with you. And that's possible that you would do that if you could really show the risk to be significant enough. It goes back to that discussion of if it's the common cold or if it's Ebola, and how do you define what's what, and how do you define what practices lead to one and what practices lead to the other? I think it would be very difficult to do. Why is this response so much different from past pandemics? Is this virus so much worse? No, I don't think so. I think I think there are two reasons. One is that China responded to this in such an authoritarian way that I think every little, politician out there is using them as an example, and it wants to replicate and mimic what they are doing to the extent that they can. I think that I also think that because it's not worse than certain pandemics, although it is others. So it's worse than H1N1, but it's not as bad as the Spanish flu. I think one is our politicians think in authoritarian ways, and the Chinese model, because they dealt with it first, is at top of their mind, and that's where they go, and that's what their intuition. Politicians, generally the way politics and bureaucracies work is they overreact to the emergency once an emergency happens. They always do. And they underreact at the beginning. They don't identify the cause in the beginning. They don't do anything until it's a major emergency, and what it is, they overreact. And how does the government overreact? Government overreacts by using guns. Government overreacts by being authoritarian, by using too much coercion and force.
Yeah, I agree.
Is social distancing a form of altruism? No, I mean, social distancing just says, it just says keep a distance from other people because it's in your self-interest, because you don't want to get the virus. And not wanting other people not to get the virus, right? Not wanting the spread of the virus to happen is not altruistic. I mean, I don't want some 80-year-old in the US getting a virus and dying because I value human life. So it's not that we as egoists should be nonchalant about this and about the risk to human life and the danger here. We should take rational measures within the context of our values in life to protect other people from a virus that we might inflict on them. So the fact that you might be carrying a virus and you're deciding to socially distance from others is not because you're placing their life, their values above yours. It's because they are part of your values. And, again, depending on whether you have the virus or not, how risky it is, and so on, you're choosing that the value of other people's lives is part of your value hierarchy, and you're choosing to behave accordingly.
Well, I mean, I think it's partially, it's not clearly defined what it is. And this is part of, there's no clear plan and no clear standard. I definitely think that the way a lot of people are practicing it or prescribing it, especially this idea that it's indefinite, that is self-sacrificial, and that's a big problem. That's but part of it is really hard to understand. So for instance, right now, I mean, I'm thinking of it as, okay, I have the ability, particularly because there's no speaking right now, I have the ability to stay at home in Orange County, and it's a pretty spacious place, and it's not that big a deal. I think other people should not engage in nearly as much social distancing. But what you'd really want is a clear understanding and a clear plan based on really valuing individual lives and productivity and value pursuit and flourishing. So that's why if you know of anyone who's really doing that, that would be nice. And it would be really nice if the government was doing that, because I'm just worried about, we just social distancing an infinite amount, and then for a year or a year and a half, like there's no end. So it's one thing if you say, it's 2 weeks, and like 2 weeks, you can totally change your environment. If somebody just said 2 weeks, like that, and it was a really clear plan, that would be totally different from, oh, just give up your pursuit of values indefinitely.
So I'll modify my answer. Social distance is, whether it's altruistic or not, depends on you, on why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and how rational are you? So in and of itself, it's neither altruistic or not. In and of itself, it's one strategy to deal with your values, and you have to figure out what those values mean for you. But the problem is that we're not just being asked to socially distance, we're being forced into socially distancing. And our values are not being taken into account of. And we are, as Alex said, we're guilted into this and forced into this. And in that sense, it's using altruism against us. So while I think we should be careful right now, and you should really think about whether you are potentially transmitting a virus or not, and again, how that fits within your hierarchy of values, I think you should be careful and you should take that into account, and other people are value to you. That's not how most people think of it, unfortunately. They think of it as a duty, and they think of it as a good sacrifice, and they dismiss other values.
You should definitely think of it as involving a cost. It always involves a cost to you. So it could be a cost that's worth it, but you need to really take that cost.
A lot of what we
value
do involves a cost to you. So this is why we have hierarchy of values, and we figure out what's more important and what's less important. And you can't do everything. You can't.
But it's an abnormal cost. I mean, it's saying that
it's a new cost, and you have to figure it out within the context of what's going on, and what does it mean to you in your life, given your profession, given what's going on with you, and what does it mean to social distance? Does it mean every single moment of the day? Does it mean with your best friends? Does it mean with older people? Does it mean with not going to work? What does it actually mean? What is the context of it? And again, I flew the other day because I had a gig to do, and as Alex said, some of our income comes from talks, and this was the one kind of conference that wasn't canceled. Everything else being canceled, and I flew, did my thing, got on a plane, flew back, because that was important for me to do. And now, if I'd known I was carrying the virus, I probably wouldn't have done it. So again, information is crucial, and risk assessment and being rational about that risk assessment is crucial, right? And so it's, and the fact that we can't test is the thing right now as a concrete that really, really pisses me off, because I really, really value information, really, really value knowledge. And I would really like to know where I am, what risk I am at, and where the other people around me are at, and how much risk are they bearing. And to me, that is an example of massive government failure in this case. And it's horrific to consider what the alternative is, which is living in a truly free country. All right. Thanks, Alex. This was fun.
Yeah, just one quick final thing, just to sort of tie it to why I was interested in coming on, and how objectivism is valuable, and particularly for maybe younger people thinking about this. Like, if you like objectivism or it intrigues you, there's a lot of exciting stuff to do with using objectivism to clarify these different fields, and I think you can create a lot of value and really stand out. And so that's just something to think about. And then in terms of just the society, we see that, if only more individualistic, humanistic, flourishing values were there, people would be thinking about this and pursuing it in different ways. And then in terms of freedom and capitalism, to the extent we have more of that, that's literally means the quality and quantity of our lives. So this just strikes me as, wow, this is a place where I'm glad that people believe in objectivist ideas to the extent they do, but if they did a lot more, this concretely would be much, much better. And so maybe that's something to think about particularly those of you who are thinking about what you want to do in life. There's a lot of exciting and valuable stuff to do.
Absolutely. This is a great illustration of the power of reason and the power of good thinking, and objectivism. That's what it's about more than anything else. It's about the power of thinking in pursuit of your life and your values. All right. Thanks, Alex. We'll definitely go on. I've got like 7 questions here on climate change and stuff. We'll leave it for another time.
Okay. And everyone, if you want more information about me, or you want to get on my mailing list, just go to industrialprogress.com. And thanks, Yaron, for having me.
Sure, my pleasure. And I'll put that as a link at the bottom on YouTube. All right.
Awesome.
Thanks, everybody. Bye,
Okay.
Alec.
Bye.